In the morning, Agatha drove us back to London, even though we offered to take the train. I wouldn't hear of it, she said. I have many friends in London whom I might visit. She used a map of the city to guide her. In a little over an hour, we pulled up in front of an elegant townhouse in the heart of the city. Clearly, we had arrived at the right place, for a steady stream of men and women were entering. Goodbye, darlings. I will return for you at about 5, Agatha said as we climbed out of the motor car. Suddenly, she went pale and pointed. What is it, Agatha? I asked, concerned, for she was trembling with excitement. She pointed at a short man with a white mustache and beard. He wore a black suit and a black stovepipe hat. That's the great playwright George Bernard Shaw, who just walked out of the building you're about to enter, she said in a voice filled with awe. How do you know it's him? Blythe asked. I follow the theater avidly, darling, she explained. I see his picture in the paper after every opening. Either he's written the play or he's accompanying some famed thespian. Yes, he's a good friend of Mr. Stead's, Mother said. Really? And look whom he has stopped to speak to, she said with a gasp. I looked in the direction she was pointing, and I saw that on his way out of the house, Shaw had indeed paused to speak to 2 men walking towards the house. One was a portly but dignified-looking gentleman with an impressive mustache and a thinning hair on his head, whom I guessed to be in his early 50s. The other man was short, clean-shaven, with curly black hair. He was much younger, probably in his early 30s. He looked somehow familiar to me, but I couldn't think of why that should be. Who are they? Emma asked. I don't know whose the younger gentleman might be, but the older one is none other than Dr. Arthur Conan Doyle. What? I cried suddenly. I heard her wrong. Indeed, Agatha confirmed. He's the author of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. Do you read him in America? I would have answered her if I could have found my voice. At that very moment, I had the newest Holmes stories, the speckled brand, tucked away in my carpet-bag. Now it was my turn to tremble in awestruck amazement. It's practically all Jane reads, Blythe informed her. I didn't know he was a doctor. Oh yes, darling, he's also a physician. I watched as Conan Doyle and his friend bade goodbye to Shaw and continued on. My heart sank to a pound, and I realized I was entering W.T. Stead's house. Why would this man of science, this paragon of rational deductive logic, be entering a convention of renowned spiritualists? There could be only one answer. He had come to debunk the mediums as frauds. Using his brilliant powers of observation, he would expose their tricks and use their wonders. This was my chance to learn the truth from the man whose words I could never doubt. It was as though Sherlock Holmes himself had come to deliver the final answer to my question. When we entered the main front room of the building, I didn't see Conan Doyle or his companion, but W.T. Stead appeared from one of the side rooms and instantly approached Mother. William, Mother greeted him warmly. By his first name, I had never heard her use it before. He was broad, open-faced, with dark brows and piercing eyes. He was a man of middle years, probably in his 50s, and wore a full white beard. Maud, at last we meet, he said, taking Mother's hand in his. You are just as you described in your letters, only more lovely by far. And these, of course, are your daughters. I can guess their names by your descriptions. She greeted my sisters each correctly by name, and you must be Jane, the aspiring journalist, he said, surmised when he got to me. Yes, sir, it is an honor to meet you. Thank you so much for the tickets, I replied. If you can spare the time, I have many questions I would love to ask you. It would be my pleasure, he said. He led us to the ballroom, where all the invited guests were assembled. There was approximately 100 or so men and women. I caught sight of Conan Doyle sitting in the far corner with his dark-haired companion. After a few moments, W.T. Stead appeared in front of the crowd and announced the room had been set up through the house for the conducting of seances. Additionally, there would be a session of tarot, Ouija board, automatic writing. Though the rest instead addressed the crowd, I couldn't take my eyes off Conan Doyle. I imagined a scheme for meeting him, in which I dropped my copy of the Strand, pretended I didn't know who he was, extravagantly causing him to like me so much that he made me his assistant. In another flight of imagination, I fantasized being invited to join him in solving a crime that took place there at the psychic convention. The Adventure of the Meddling Mediums is what it would be called, and I was featured as the American Girl. After Stead's speech in the paper was posted announcing the morning's events, with different mediums, psychics, being assigned to various rooms. Mother was to join a circle of mediums in an attempt to contact Queen Victoria herself, in the hope of getting her to comment on the present situation, perhaps give a word of sage advice for her quarreling descendants. I noticed Mother engaged in conversation with a balding, pleasant-looking man in his early 50s. "This is Mr. Robertson," she introduced when I approached. "This is my daughter, Jane. She would also like to be a writer herself." "Pleased to meet you," I greeted him. "You're not a medium or a psychic, then?" "No, my experience is as a merchant marine and later a writer of sea stories," he said. His speech immediately revealed him to be American. "Have you read any of them?" "No, I don't think so." I couldn't recall ever reading a sea story. "But your name is familiar to me," I said. Truthfully, I struggle to recollect where I heard of him. "Perhaps you've read Sinful Peck," he suggested. "I should think not," Mother demurred. "Not with a title like that." "It's not as scandalous as you might think, Mr. Robinson said with a laugh. "It's a sea story like my others." "What brings you to the conference?" Mother asked him. "Well, madame, it's a funny thing. Although I have a great deal of personal experience of the sea, my father was also a captain on the Great Lakes. I always have the sensation that my stories is coming to me as visions of the future." "You're a psychic," Mother said. "I don't usually admit to this freely, but I believe I am," he said. "I'm confident this to my fellow writer, Mr. Stead. He invited me to come to the conference to explore my possible futures." "Best of luck to you, Mr. Robinson," Mother said, departing to meet with other mediums and her Queen Victoria seance in the library on the second floor. "Since you are both writers, I'm wondering if you knew Dr. Conan Doyle," I said. "I met the man once, though I don't really know him," Mr. Robinson replied. "He's Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, you know. He was knighted for his services as a doctor in South Africa during the Boer War, and for writing about it. Do you know why he's here?" "I do know he's here with the British Society of Psychical Research. That's the most respected group of researchers all occurrences of supernatural." "He's a believer?" "He calls himself an agnostic, which means one who does not know." I suddenly had the name for what I was, an agnostic. It was reassuring to know that it couldn't be a name something other than confused, bewildered, or unsure. I spoke about writing a bit further with Mr. Robinson, and then the difficulties of getting published. He agreed to make some time to discuss professional writings with me. On the last day of the conference, thanking him profusely, I hurried off to Mother's seance. When I reached the second floor library, Amelie, Emma, and Blythe were already inside. Mother had talked to the fellow mediums about allowing the twins to join them as their linked hands around the table. Ted was one of the participants along with two others. A very average-looking middle-aged man and an elderly woman. A large glass ball was in the center of the table. Blythe and I were permitted to observe as long as we promised not to interfere with even the slightest sound. We sat on straight-back chairs lined against the wall. Just as the seance was about to begin, Conan Doyle slipped quietly into the room and took a seat right beside me. I was dying to say something to him, but I had promised my silence. With the lights very dim, Stead began the session by summoning the Queen to come and help her country last time. Conan Doyle leaned close to me. "There's no rest for the weary, I take it," he quibbled irrelevantly. "The old girls rule for over 50 years, and they still want her to work." Stead stopped talking, and all the mediums looked at us annoyance. "Sorry," Conan Doyle apologized. "Proceed." Stead resumed his attempt to summon the Queen's spirit. After a few moments, one by one, the other mediums, including Mother, joined in. The elderly woman grew forceful, raising her voice, demanding that the Queen Victoria appeared in the same tone one might command a dog to sit. I didn't imagine the Queen who had once ruled half the world would respond well to that approach. All of this calling, conjuring, and commanding went on for the better part of 15 minutes. Blythe sat forward to watch. Conan Doyle had slid low in his chair, his arms wrapped around his belly. This could go on all day. He complained to me under his breath. "You don't think she'll show up?" I whispered. "I hope she would, so I could expose them in some fakery," he confided. "You're not a believer?" I asked. "Not for a second," he answered in a low voice. Stead asked irk Wise and myself to observe and alert him to signs of the fraudulence. He gave me Taft's accurate information. Just to hear him speak was heaven. He was exactly like I imagined the voice of Dr. Watson in the Holmes stories. Forevermore I would hear the rich, resonant voice speaking when I read the text of Sherlock Holmes' adventures. If it's a fraud, why is nothing happening? I quietly inquired. My intuition is that this particular people are honest but misguided. They've set out to do something impossible and thus derived no result. I looked over at Mother, whose eyes were shut, her brows furrowed in concentration. She was quietly tried to summon the Queen. Emma and Amelie were also closed their eyes and were gently rocking back and forth. Then abruptly Emma lurched forward, breaking the chain, her hands holstered. Surging rivers of gushing blood, she cried, throwing her arms open. Her eyes were now wide, and through viewing the horror she spoke. Amelie's face was contorted into an expression of absolute terror, and she sat room-rod straight in her chair. Do not do this thing, my child. Stop it now, I say. It is chaos, it is suicide, it is damnation. This is not Emma's voice. It's not even Amelie's, speaking through her. Her right arm swung around like a compass finding true north, and she pointed to Conan Doyle. You will suffer such unbearable pain. I weep for your intolerable loss. The color drained from his face, and Emma locked him in a fierce, wild stare. Brace yourself, man. Your son will go to fight in France, and he will not return. This was too much. I'd hoped fiercely that he did not have a son. I wanted to scold Emma for demanding that she stop saying such awful things. I stood to admonish her, but I never got the chance. Heed your warning, from a queen to a boy king, Emma shouted. Conan Doyle let out a strangled cry of surprised anguish. It was the exact same moment Emma and Amelie both crumpled to the floor. One of the mediums threw a light switch, and everybody rushed to their aid. Lifting them by the shoulders, patting their cheeks, giving them room to breathe, Mother commanded, "Step back." I noticed that Conan Doyle, his palms pressed over his eyes, the trail of tears running down his face from either side. Was it possible that this paragon of logic had been reduced to such a state by Emma's predictions? Apparently it was so.